My guest today is Choctaw composer Charles Shadle, whose new album, Choctaw Places, takes us on a musical journey through landscapes, memories, and stories that are all tied to his heritage. Charles Shadle joins me now to talk about the inspiration, the music, and the meaning behind the music. Welcome to FM 91.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to chat with you today.
So we're talking about an album of yours called Choctaw Places, which, as we speak, comes out tomorrow, I believe.
That is
And
correct.
yeah, so let's get to know you a little better. Tell us about yourself. I mean, you have an extensive resume as a composer, but also as a teacher.
Right. I have taught at MIT for 3 decades now. Um, Composition, harmony, uh, those kinds of classes, and some music history as well.
Let's talk about, for people who don't know the story of the Choctaw Indians, maybe you can talk a little bit about your heritage.
Certainly. The Choctaw people now live in southeastern Oklahoma. We're actually the third largest Native American tribe, with approximately a quarter of a million members who are enrolled in the tribe. Our historic homeland was in Alabama and mostly Mississippi, and we were essentially forcibly removed by the United States government beginning in the 1830s. So we made a long journey from Mississippi to Oklahoma on what is usually referred to as the Trail of Tears. Um, Once we were established in Oklahoma, we rebuilt our government, our sort of structures, and were set up as an actual sort of functioning government, a functioning nation. And we now sort of live in the same part of Oklahoma. We are now considered a Native American reservation, but we continue to have sort of strong, you know, legal systems. We have our own court systems. We have our own law enforcement officers, but we also work very sort of carefully with federal governments and state governments as well.
Now, how does your heritage fit into the music you write? How is it affected? And this album in particular.
Right. Um, That's it's really at the core of what I do musically, I think, in this album, in that there are elements of the music, and I know for this sort of casual listener, it maybe doesn't feel very Native American because there's a whole series of sort of stereotypical expectations that are out there in terms of what that should be. But within the Choctaw tradition, for example, percussion plays essentially no role whatsoever, right? So that sort of traditional Indian Hollywood approach to, the tom-tom and all of that, and while it's an important part of other tribes' cultures, and in fact, in a sort of pan-Indian powwow culture as well, but that's not innate to sort of Choctaw ways of working. We also have two important musical traditions. The first of which is what we refer to as a social dance tradition, and that is a dance tradition where vocal music accompanies it, and it is based on very sort of ancient traditions. And while I borrow some melodic influences from that, some structural, some rhythmic emphasis from it, and in fact, our Choctaw fondness for pieces in 6/4 meter comes from that tradition. Um, and that happens in my music a good bit. Um, that's a tradition that I don't engage with as much just because the people who practice that tradition feel that it's a sort of unchanging, kind of immutable thing. And I don't feel like I have the right to sort of play with that tradition. Our second tradition, which is much more commonly practiced historically, was a shaped note Christian hymn tradition, right? And that is sort of all over my music. That music, both its sort of, you know, harmonic textures, its melodies sort of based on sort of gap scales and modality is very much something that is important to me. And it's really part of my heritage because when I was quite young, just entering my teens, my great aunt gave me a copy of the Sacred Harp that had been passed down through the family through, I believe it's 5 generations, maybe 6, from a distant ancestor who brought that volume of music on the Trail of Tears. And it's always had a sort of talismanic kind of emphasis and place in my life, just because when you think you're a refugee, you have to take only what you can really carry with you. What does it mean that the thing you choose to carry is a book of music?
Mm. Well, let's talk about the music on this recording, starting with the Oklahoma Choctaw Cycle. And there are three different movements, each with a name. They're Limestone Gap, Red Cedar, and the Old Place. Are those real places in your mind? Where do they come from?
Yes, absolutely. Limestone Gap is a community just really a few miles north of where our family ranch was in Atoka County, Oklahoma. And it's a sort of dramatic part of the landscape where a river runs sort of between a couple of limestone hills with sort of dramatic cliffs. And that's been kind of the main passage through the Choctaw Nation for hundreds of years and even predating the Choctaw in Oklahoma. So it's sort of beautiful, surrounded by limestone hills with sort of lots of trees. Especially oaks are very common. And there was once a sort of old house uh, at Limestone Gap that was built by a prominent uh, Choctaw rancher and also one of what we refer to as our light horsemen, part of the tribal police built just before the Civil War. So that sort of enters into it, and my music tries to both evoke the sense of the place now and also the sense of the kinds of music that it would have been heard sort of in the heyday of that really now vanished community. So that's a real place. And the old place, the third of these pieces, is also a real place. And that was the oldest of the sort of houses on my family's ranch. It no longer exists, and in fact, the whole landscape around it has been changed by quarrying operations. Uh, but that's a place that I've visited many times. The foundations still remain, and you can find it. Red cedar, of course, refers to the very familiar sort of tree, which is sort of ubiquitous, not sort of. It is ubiquitous in Oklahoma, and in fact, there are many projects now going to sort of remove them as an invasive species, although they are also native to the area. Um, but even though I'm allergic to cedar pollen, I find the sort of shape of the red cedar quite remarkable. So the piece pays a tribute to that. It plays a tribute to the cedar's role in Choctaw culture, and particularly as a sort of marker for rural cemeteries, right? Because people would plant sort of red cedars, just like they plant yew trees in the UK, as a sort of way to have a permanent marker of these sacred spots. It also evokes bird song, our hymn tradition. So those are all sort of parts of these things. So yes, two of them are real places, and the middle movement is a kind of real thing that's part of our Choctaw landscape.
Now, am I right in saying that you composed each of those movements at different times and then brought them together for this suite?
I did, right? They use the same ensemble, right? The Pierrot ensemble. But they were written at different times, and they are each intended to be heard separately if one so wishes. The last movement borrows from material that can be found in the other two, to sort of make it something that sums the others up, but I think it also can stand on its own. That was at least my intention. But all of the pieces in terms of their instrumentation, little melodic ideas, and their sort of sense of exploring a Choctaw identity make them in some way unified as well.
I notice we should say it's chamber music. I mean, you mentioned the Pierrot Ensemble. Uh, in the beginning of Limestone Gap, I hear a solo flute, and the flute kind of has this ultra real kind of sense sound to it. And it's also associated with Native Americans. I mean, were you thinking in that direction when you wrote it?
Absolutely, right? As both a sort of evocation of the world at Limestone, Limestone Gap as it exists today, but also there is a flute tradition in Native American culture widely, and in Choctaw culture, flutes were made out of river cane, a sort of bamboo-like plant that was found both in the Choctaw homelands in Oklahoma, and also Mississippi. Historically, this is sort of before the 19th century, those flutes basically only played one or two pitches. Modern Choctaw flute makers have altered it so that it works like other sorts of Native American flutes and has a much wider range of melodic possibilities. But I want to take some of my sense of those instruments and sort of transfer it to sort of the modern flute, because my sort of harmonic world needs to be able to move around much more than that more traditional instrument would be able to do.
Yeah. Um, let's talk about the second piece on the disc, Chanta Aisha. Is that how you say it?
Choctaw
Choctaw Places?
Aisha, yes.
Okay, close enough. It's in 5 movements. Each of them have very different moods. I wonder, did you view it as separate pieces or did you view it as one long work? I mean, what is the story behind that piece?
Well, thank you for asking about that because people have sometimes talked about it as a sort of suite, and I don't hear it that way, right? It feels to me like a single work that we've sort of tracked as five separate sections for convenience for listeners on the CD. For me, it's a work that grew directly out of the pandemic. And in fact, I was hoping to be able to be in Oklahoma when I was starting to write it, but it still wasn't really safe to travel. And we hadn't been vaccinated fully yet by then. So I ended up sort of writing it from a very internalized place of sort of thinking about these places, remembering them, talking to friends and other Choctaws about these places. And so, again, memory plays a real role in the work. There are other things that play a real role in the work, right? And one of them was something that came to mean a tremendous amount to me during lockdown was late Beethoven, right? And I had never I had never intensely loved late Beethoven, but at that kind of moment, somehow it became very important. So, sort of elements from late Beethoven, those tend to make, in the piano sonatas and in the quartets, sort of large cumulative works out of oftentimes much smaller sections. Plays a role in Chata Aisha. It's also scored for a smaller ensemble. It's an oboe quartet, although the oboe player um, also doubles English horn. And the second and fourth sections of that work are essentially solo pieces for the wind instrument. They're sort of cadenza-like, but they're feel to me less ornamental maybe than that. And other instruments do sometimes participate, yeah, in what's going on. But I do hear it as a sort of single span. And in fact, the fifth section of the work is a kind of recapitulation of the opening movement as well.
Yeah. Well, your musical language is so interesting because it's not melodic like Beethoven, but it's very listenable. It has sections that you can hang your ear on. So I think that's just me fanboying to you.
Well,
Right.
well, thank you. I really appreciate that because that's very important to me, right? You want to take tradition forward, right? Choctaw traditions, the traditions of classical music as well, right? And you want to bring those forward in ways that are sort of meaningful for our contemporary society, our contemporary ears. But it seems to me, for a composer, you still need to do moments in the music where people can really hang on to what's going on. Parts
Mm.
of it will be difficult, right? But there also needs to be sort of moments of repose, moments where you can say, oh, yeah, that's a tune. I understand what that is, right? Or that's a texture that keeps coming back and shaping the way I hear the piece. So I think those are all at least part of my responsibility as a composer, or at least as I see it.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about your collaborators on this disc, the Lontano Ensemble and conductor Odaline de Martinez? What's your history with them?
Right. I have a very long history, but it's circuitous and sort of interesting in that respect. When I was in my early 20s and doing a master's degree in composition at Tulane University, um, we did an opera called Sister Amy about Amy Semple McPherson, the sort of one of the inventors of sort of popular evangelism, and one of the first big sexual scandals surrounds her in early 20th century America. And so Odaline, everyone calls her Chachi, had written a wonderful opera about this. She was a former Tulane student who had graduated, then gone to England to the Royal College of Music and had established a career there. But she had written this opera, and Tulane performed it, and I had the pleasure of being one of the rehearsal pianists for it. So I got to know her music, and then she came for the performance, and I got to know her as well. Then years later, my colleague here at MIT, Peter Child, brought Chachi and her ensemble Lontano to play at MIT and asked if I would write a piece for that. And the piece that I wrote for them was Limestone Gap, right? That was successful. The players were wonderful with it, very excited about it. And so Chachi then over time asked me to write um, Red Cedar and then finally Limestone Gap. And I'm actually doing a piece for them in 26, 27. So it's been a really, really important part of sort of my musical adventure. because it was sort of the first moment in which, a sort of substantial piece of music was being played at this really extraordinarily intense, polished, and beautiful level, right? And that was really inspiring for me as a composer, and I wanted to sort of go on and make my music better, more expressive, so that more and more, really first-rate groups of people would want to play it. Because that's a really special thing for a composer. Now, it has to be said, there are lots of times where amateur groups play your music and play it wonderfully, and that's incredibly valuable too. But just this sort of moment of having the music have this sort of polish and sheen to it was a really powerful experience for me. So when the opportunity to record the pieces with them came along, I was incredibly excited.
Yeah, do you think that because your music is very expressive, do you think that the chamber ensemble, fewer forces but more diverse sources, is more expressive than, say, if you're writing for large forces? You know what I mean?
Well, that's probably true, right? It certainly has that kind of intimacy that's built into it. But as a composer, it's fun to write for a big orchestra too, right? They just kind of do different things, right? You sort of, when writing for the Piero ensemble, those five instruments, you can get away with a lot of counterpoint. If you tried to have that much going on in an orchestral work at any given moment, it would be a real challenge, right? But I think you as a composer, you just adapt what you want to say to the kinds of things that are most appropriate for the forces you're using. If I'm writing a tiny little piano piece for a beginner pianist, it's a very different set of requirements and set of things that you do, but it's always really fun to see if you can make your voice sort of present even in something really simple. It's easy to have your voice, present in something that's quite complicated, or quite sophisticated, but the real challenge is how simple can you make that on occasion?
The album is called Choctaw Places. It's a chamber music of Charles Shadle. Charles, thank you so much for the music and for spending time with us today.
Thank you as well. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you.